Jazz fusion is a broad and eclectic subgenre of jazz that rose to prominence during the 1970s. Its creation stemmed from jazz's need to adapt to the dramatically shifting musical landscape and was fueled by advancements in music technology. The subgenre gets its name from the musical fusion of styles like Latin, funk, rock, and many others to the larger jazz framework. Fusion was able to usher in a new generation of musicians and a new chapter for jazz's enduring legacy. Its inception can be traced to one of music's most seminal icons, Miles Davis. Throughout his career, Davis was constantly adapting and pushing the boundaries of jazz. This desire to innovate was taken a step further towards the end of the 60s, when Davis's style of music underwent a drastic change. On his 1968 album, Miles in the Sky, Davis departed from conventional jazz arrangements and embraced compositions that were more groove-orientated. Not to mention, this record also marked the first time Davis ever used an electric instrument, and, consequently, the beginning of what has been labelled his electric period. Together, these elements dictated a shift in Davis's musical philosophy. In a retrospective review of Miles in the Sky for AllMusic, Stephen Thomas Erlewine writes that Miles Davis explicitly pushed his second great quintet away from conventional jazz and toward the jazz-rock hybrid that would later become known as fusion. Erlewine goes on to say that Miles in the Sky feels like a transitional album, and like many transitional albums, it's intriguing and frustrating in equal measure. By describing the album as frustrating, Erlewine may be referring to the fact that, although Davis's new brand of jazz was exciting, it had not yet been perfected. It was only 3 years later, after the albums Feed the Kilimanjaro and In a Silent Way, that Miles Davis's experimentation with jazz culminated in something truly supreme. Bitches Brew. Although it's all well and good to praise Davis's innovation, where did his inspiration come from, and why did this drastic change occur at this particular point in time?
And jazz musicians saw it as their duty to try to embrace amateur musicianship to be a part of the popular trend. As a result, they changed the sound and feeling of jazz into something called jazz rock. It's also called fusion.
Adaptation was the name of the game for jazz at this time, so around this period Miles Davis reportedly started listening to artists like Aretha Franklin, James Brown, and Sly and the Family Stone, to name a few. He wanted to find out what music was selling, what was hot, and how he could introduce that into his own music in a nuanced way. This essentially resulted in Davis revising the fundamentals of arranging and composing jazz, introducing new instruments to his ensemble, utilizing effects and pedals to treat his trumpet, and adopting innovative editing techniques to take music production to higher levels.
You want to jump on somebody, solo or whatever, and make it a multiple thing. That was all right too, because in those days I might have had 6 tracks or 8 tracks. So I said, hey, I could use this, I could drop this out, add this, add that, and maybe use Miles in sort of a reverb way, in a different way, with all the machines that I have at my disposal.
The fruits of his labour, of course, resulted in the fresh sound that was developed throughout these first 3 albums and that was undoubtedly perfected on Bitches Brew. Having sold over 500,000 copies upon its release, Bitches Brew was destined to become a genre-defining record. Its widespread acclaim was a sign that this new and unorthodox brand of jazz had a market and appeal. It's no surprise then that many of the promising young musicians that played on Bitches Brew went on to form what have now been recognised as the 4 most noteworthy and successful jazz fusion bands ever. These musicians perpetuated what Davis had started and each sculpted out their own trademark style of jazz fusion. Weather Report was the first to be established with the release of its eponymous LP in 1971. Founders Wayne Shorter and Joe Zawinul acted as the focal points of the group that went on to release 14 records across an illustrious 15-year span. John McLaughlin and Billy Cobham set up the Mahavishnu Orchestra and released their first record in mid-1971. The group embodied a more rock-influenced form of jazz fusion and would go on to release 8 albums across 28 years. Founded by Chick Corea and Airto Moreira, Return to Forever released their debut self-titled LP in 1972. Although their first record personified a Latin-infused strain of fusion, the group's sound evolved into something more rock-based across 5 years and 6 album releases. Lastly, the Headhunters were a group formed by Herbie Hancock and released their hit debut LP in 1973. Although the Headhunters were a recognized group, Their first 2 records were released under Hancock's name, presumably to bank on Hancock being a known figure in the jazz world. For the sake of detail, it's worth noting that Hancock did not appear on the official release of Bitches Brew, but was featured in the complete Bitches Brew sessions, and was a longtime collaborator of Davis's. Of course, these 4 groups weren't the only exponents of fusion. Throughout the 70s, there were a whole number of bands and individuals that contributed to the dialogue. But one thing that united nearly all of them is their exposure and immersion to traditional jazz in their formative years. Having been trained in bop, modal or bebop meant that they could subvert conventions and structures with the view to innovate. This was vitalized by all the advancements in music technology that meant they could completely reinvent the sound of jazz. But how exactly did the music change? What would help give us a better idea of the musical and technological changes that took place would be to compare 2 versions of the same composition made before and after the birth of fusion. The composition is Watermelon Man by Herbie Hancock, which was originally released on his first LP, Taken Off, in 1962. 11 years later, on Headhunters, Hancock revisited the same composition but in a jazz fusion style. The primary differences between the 2 versions are representative of the wide-scale changes that occurred when traditional jazz musicians moved to jazz fusion. The first notable change is the use of new technology and instruments. The original version of Watermelon Man was recorded with an acoustic quintet. If we compare this to the newer version, we can see that the double bass has been switched out by an electric bass guitar, and the piano replaced by keyboards, clavinets, and synthesizers. These instruments in particular became ubiquitous within jazz fusion, especially certain models of keyboards and clavinets like the Fender Rhodes and Hohner D6, both of which were used by Hancock in the 1973 version through the innovative technique of overdubbing. This effectively meant Hancock was able to layer different instruments and musical phrases over one another in the editing process. Another key point is the shift in approach to arrangement and songwriting. The original composition followed a standard 16-bar blues structure. It had a clear melody and had 3 solos for the trumpet, saxophone and piano. As you can see, the structure was tight and rigid. Every instrument had its part and followed the blueprint. The new version, on the other hand, prioritized groove over structure. We can already see that the composition flows a lot more and isn't so rigid. The track begins by slowly adding and layering instruments to create a thicker groove, and then eventually ends by slowly fading each instrument back out. Additionally, there aren't any solos in the new track, which substantiates the point that this version focuses more on the groove. Next is the actual fusion aspect, i.e. the influence and incorporation of elements from other genres into the jazz framework. The main one here being the influence of funk music, and this is best shown through the drums and the bass. On the original version, the drum beat is played mainly on the ride and snare, as was typical of jazz at the time. Although the bass drum is played, it's very low in the mix and you can't really hear it that well. The drum beat in the new version is played on a closed hi-hat, the bass drum is more prominent, and there's a very solid backbeat that always falls on the 2 and the 4. A similar thing happens with the bass. In the original, the double bass has a simple part and could barely be heard, but the electric bass guitar in the new version has a more dynamic role to play. The importance and prominence of the drums and bass in contemporary funk music clearly affected the composition of the new Watermelon Man. Of course, this is just an isolated example, but a lot of the outline changes in musical aesthetics and practices were embraced by many jazz artists at the time. Jazz has been incorporating foreign musical elements into its framework for decades and will undoubtedly continue to do so. The birth of jazz fusion gave the genre a newfound commercialism and accessibility. It was revitalizing and represented jazz's willingness to adapt and survive in the ever-changing musical climate. It was an important era in jazz's history, one that many genres and artists would take inspiration from in the years to come. Thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed the video and you want to support the channel, then please comment, share and subscribe. See you in the next one.